Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we are stepping into the world of one of history's most brutal civilizations, ancient Sparta. But this is not a romantic tale of noble warriors or tales of heroic sacrifice. This is a descent into a society so harsh, so deliberately cruel, that surviving even a single day would break most modern humans. So get comfortable. Settle into the darkness, and let us explore why ancient Sparta was not a place of glory, but a machine designed to obliterate the human spirit. When we think of Sparta, our minds often conjure images of warriors standing resolute against impossible odds, their red cloaks billowing in the wind as they hold back Persian hordes. The stories we have inherited paint a portrait of masculine virtue, of discipline and honor. But the truth, the deeper, darker truth, is far more sinister. Sparta was not built to celebrate human potential. It was engineered to crush it, to reshape it, to weaponize it. And if you, a person from the modern world, were somehow transported to ancient Sparta, and expected to survive a single day as an ordinary citizen, you would find yourself in a nightmare from which there is no waking. The Spartans understood something that many other civilizations struggled with. They understood that to create an invincible army, you could not simply teach young men to fight. You had to destroy everything in them that might resist. You had to eliminate compassion, individuality, and the very concept of personal choice. The Spartans created a system, the agoge, that was so comprehensive, so all-consuming, that it touched every aspect of existence from the moment a child drew breath until the moment they died. This system was not designed to educate, it was designed to annihilate. Let us begin with something fundamental. The moment you arrived in Sparta, you would immediately understand that you had entered a place fundamentally alien to human civilization as you know it. There were no luxury goods, no beautiful pottery on display, no merchants selling imported wines or spices, no art galleries celebrating human achievement. The very streets would feel austere, almost punitive. Every building was utilitarian, built with stone and wood, designed purely for function. There were no theaters, well, almost none. No public gathering spaces for leisure or entertainment. This was a civilization that had made a deliberate choice to reject beauty, comfort, and the things that make life worth living. And this rejection was not incidental to Spartan life. It was the entire foundation upon which their society rested. But let us travel deeper into what survival would actually look like. The physical ordeal of the agoge. If you were male and of free Spartan birth, your day would begin when you were 7 years old, and it would never truly end. At age 7, every Spartan boy was removed from his mother's care and placed into the agoge, a centrally organized system of military education that can only be described as systematic child abuse, dressed in the language of discipline. Your mother would never hold you again as her child. From this point forward, you belonged to the state. The word agoge itself comes from the Greek word meaning to raise, much like the process of raising livestock. And this is precisely how the Spartans viewed your existence. You were to be raised toward a single purpose, becoming a perfect instrument of war. Every decision about your body, your mind, your time, and your relationships would be made for you. You had no agency. You had no choice. You were a tool being forged. Your day would begin before dawn. The cold air of the Peloponnesian climate, and yes, even in the spring and summer, the mornings were chilly, would wake you as you lay on a thin mat, often without a blanket, despite the winter months that would see temperatures drop to around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. You would have perhaps a thin cloak, and that would be your entire protection against the elements. Your body would ache. It always ached. Pain was your constant companion, as familiar as your own heartbeat. You would rise with the other boys in your age cohort, perhaps 30 or 40 of them, all crowded into a dormitory-style barracks. There was no privacy. There would never be privacy again. You would use communal latrines with no doors, no walls separating you from the others. Your bodily functions were not personal matters. They were state matters, observed and assessed. Were you sick? Too weak? This would be noted. Everything about you was recorded. The physical training would begin immediately. Every morning, you would undergo hours of calisthenics designed to forge your body into something harder than stone. Running across rocky terrain barefoot until your feet bled and calloused over. Wrestling with other boys, not as sport, but as a genuine test of strength and will. The instructors, older boys and adult men, would watch with cold eyes. They were not there to encourage you. They were there to test your limits and push you beyond them. By the time you reached adolescence, your body would be a mass of scars, bruises, and calluses. Every muscle would have been pushed to its absolute limit, torn down, and rebuilt again and again. You would have learned to ignore pain. In fact, ignoring pain was a virtue. Complaining about pain was grounds for ridicule, for further punishment, for social ostracism. You learned to grit your teeth and continue, even when your body screamed at you to stop. This was not strength. This was the systematic destruction of your capacity to listen to your own body's signals. The training was intentionally harsh because the Spartans believed that hardship bred virtue. If you suffered, you would become strong. If you endured pain, you would develop character. If you were constantly pushed to the edge of your physical capabilities, you would emerge as something more than human, a perfect warrior. But there was a terrible cost to this philosophy, one that few Spartans ever acknowledged. They were creating a generation of men who were profoundly damaged psychologically, men who had learned to dissociate from their bodies and from their emotions. The physical ordeal was compounded by the fact that you would never be allowed to rest. Even when you were not actively training, you were being observed. The Spartans believed in constant surveillance. Every older boy watched every younger boy. Every adult male watched all the children. There was an elaborate system of hierarchy, where older boys had authority over younger ones and could report any infractions to the adult overseers. In this environment of constant scrutiny, you could never let your guard down. You could never be vulnerable. You could never truly be yourself. And the physical demands would not ease as you grew older. At age 18, you would transition into a phase called the Habantes, the most competitive aspect of the young Spartan's education. During these 2 years, you would continue your military training, but now you would also be serving as an instructor for younger boys and as part of the home garrison. The competitive environment meant that you were constantly being evaluated, constantly being compared to your peers, constantly watching over your shoulder, wondering if you were strong enough, brave enough, worthy enough to continue. Thousands did not survive this phase with their minds intact. Some fell away, unable to continue. Others remained, but were forever marked as failures. Consider the cumulative impact of this. From age 7 until at least age 30, when you might achieve full citizenship, you would have spent over 2 decades in an environment designed to eliminate your individuality, to break you down physically and psychologically, to teach you that your body was not your own, but property of the state. You would have been trained to value obedience above all else. You would have been taught that the only worthy life was one spent in service to the military. You would have internalized a profound sense of worthlessness outside of combat. For a modern human transported to this reality, the physical ordeal alone would likely be fatal. Your body, conditioned to comfort and ease, would break. Your untrained muscles would cramp and fail. Your feet would blister so severely that infection would set in. Your caloric intake would be so insufficient to meet the demands placed upon your body that you would begin to starve. And psychologically, the constant stress, the complete loss of autonomy, the systematic breaking of your will, these would push you towards psychological breakdown within the first few weeks. Starvation and the brutal diet. But the physical training would pale in comparison to the deliberate starvation program that would be implemented against you. The Spartan diet was not a diet in the modern sense. It was not a nutritional plan. It was a weapon wielded against the populace to forge their bodies and break their spirits. Imagine existing on 2 meals per day, not 2 substantial meals, 2 meager rations designed to keep you barely functional. In most of ancient Greece, people ate 4 meals daily, including breakfast, lunch, afternoon snacks, and dinner. The variety was remarkable by ancient standards. They enjoyed wheat bread, figs, olives, honey, wine diluted with water. But in Sparta, you would eat only twice. And when you did eat, you would receive barley. Not wheat, which was considered luxurious and weak-making. Barley, which was sometimes fed to slaves and animals in other parts of Greece, was deemed superior by the Spartans because they believed it was more nutritious and because it reinforced the message that Spartan warriors were beyond such mortal concerns as comfort. Your barley would be prepared into simple cakes or porridge. Perhaps occasionally you would receive a small portion of meat, goat, sheep, or pork, if you were fortunate. Fish might appear if you were stationed near the coast, but this was rare. Cheese made from goat or sheep milk would be available, as would figs and wine, but the quantities would be strictly controlled, rationed in a way that ensured you received enough calories to maintain your ability to function as a soldier, but never enough to feel satisfied, never enough to feel strong, never enough to feel anything but a constant gnawing hunger. The infamous black broth that the Spartans consumed was perhaps the most eloquent statement of their values. This was not food designed to nourish. This was food designed to humble. The black broth consisted of boiled pig's blood and the boiled meat from a pig's leg, seasoned with vinegar. The result was a dark, unappetizing substance that was both humiliating to eat and difficult to digest. When you consumed it, you were not enjoying a meal. You were submitting to a ritual of self-denial, a public statement that you valued discipline over pleasure, obedience over appetite. The Spartans deliberately kept their citizens hungry. They believed that a hungry man was a better warrior. A hungry man had less energy for rebellion. A hungry man could be controlled. A hungry man experienced life as a constant, low-level crisis that did not require external stress to be maintained. The stress was internal, physical, omnipresent. Every Spartan citizen was also required to contribute a portion of whatever he produced to his syssitia, his communal mess hall. These contributions were mandatory. Failure to contribute meant expulsion from the mess, which resulted in loss of citizenship. So you would work, or you would ensure that the helots working your land produced enough so that you could contribute your share while keeping enough for yourself to survive. But the system was calibrated so that most Spartans lived on the edge of subsistence, always uncertain if they would have enough, always aware that one bad harvest, one failed contribution, could result in complete social collapse. All adult Spartan males ate together in these communal mess halls called syssitias. There was no private dining. There were no family meals. Even when you married, you would still go to the mess hall to eat with your military unit rather than with your wife and children. Your wife would eat separately with the other women. The children would eat separately with the other children. Family bonds, even the fundamental human bond of sharing food together, were deliberately severed and replaced with state-sanctioned communal eating. Imagine the psychological impact of this. Food, which is perhaps the most primal and fundamental human need, becomes a tool of control. Hunger becomes a constant state of existence. The sharing of food, which in most human cultures is a bond of intimacy and love, becomes a collective act of military submission. You do not eat because you are hungry. You eat because the state has determined that you must eat at this specific time, in this specific place, in this specific way, and you must consume what you are given, even if it nauseates you, even if it fills you with revulsion. The starvation program would have profound effects on your body over time. Chronic malnutrition weakens the immune system. You would be susceptible to every disease that swept through the population. Your bones would be brittle. Your teeth would deteriorate rapidly. The few instances where Spartan remains have been studied by modern archaeologists reveal populations ravaged by nutritional deficiency. Your organs would be stressed. Your cognitive function would deteriorate. Your mood would be affected. Hunger creates irritability, depression, and a sense of despair. And the starvation served another purpose. It kept the Spartan population small and controllable. Malnourished women had fewer successful pregnancies. Children suffered higher mortality rates. The population growth was suppressed not through policy, but through the systematic deprivation of nutrition. Those who survived this culling would be the strongest, the most resilient, the most willing to suffer. But those strong survivors would also be deeply traumatized, profoundly damaged by years of deliberate deprivation. For a modern person transported to Sparta, the hunger would be absolutely agonizing. Your body, accustomed to regular, substantial meals, would enter a state of crisis immediately. Within days, you would experience constant hunger pangs. Within weeks, your mental acuity would begin to decline. Your ability to concentrate would diminish. Your mood would plummet into depression. The physical sensations of hunger would become so overwhelming that you would find it nearly impossible to think about anything else. And unlike the Spartan boys, who were conditioned from infancy to accept and manage hunger, you would have no psychological framework for coping with this sustained deprivation. The hunger alone could kill you, not through immediate starvation, but through the long, slow process of malnutrition leading to organ failure and disease. The crypteia, terror in the night. But let us shift our attention to something even more sinister than starvation and physical abuse. Let us speak of the crypteia, the secret police force that operated in the shadows of Spartan society. The Crypteia was composed of selected young men, probably between the ages of 21 and 30, men who had demonstrated exceptional intelligence and capability during their time in the agoge. These men were chosen for a purpose so dark, so morally corrupting, that even ancient historians struggled to fully comprehend and explain it. They were sent out into the countryside with instructions simple and devastating. Identify and eliminate perceived threats to Spartan power, primarily from among the Helot population. The Helots were the enslaved agricultural workers who formed the foundation of the Spartan economy. They were not chattel slaves in the way we might understand the term. They were something worse, state-owned slaves, bound to the land they worked, unable to be sold or transferred. They lived in constant fear of their Spartan masters, and with good reason. The Spartans declared war on the Helots every year, a formal declaration that created a legal framework for their murder. This was not metaphorical war. This was an explicit authorization to kill. The Crypteia was the instrument through which this authorization was carried out. Young Spartan warriors would be sent out into the mountains and countryside, armed only with daggers, carrying minimal provisions. They would hide during the day in remote locations, waiting with patience and predatory stillness. Then, when night fell, they would emerge and hunt. They hunted human beings. They stalked Helots as they traveled home from the fields. They found them working or resting and slaughtered them without mercy. According to the historian Heraclides Lembus, the Crypteia would slaughter Helots as they think necessary, actively targeting the sturdiest and best of them, effectively implementing a program of selective assassination designed to eliminate Helot leaders before resistance could be organized. The purpose was simultaneously tactical and psychological. Tactically, by eliminating Helot leaders, the Spartans suppressed potential rebellions. Psychologically, the mere knowledge that young assassins roamed the night, that death could come without warning, without cause, without recourse, kept the Helot population in a state of permanent terror. Imagine living in such an environment. You are a Helot, enslaved to the land. You work from dawn until dusk, producing food for your Spartan masters. Your wife and children share your enslaved status. Every night, you retire to your simple dwelling, knowing that young men with knives might be waiting in the darkness. There is no protection. There is no recourse. If you are killed, there is no trial, no investigation, no consequence for your killer. Your death is not a crime. It is merely an execution of a power that your masters have assumed over you. And if you were a Spartan participating in the Crypteia, you were being asked to become a murderer in service to the state. You were being asked to suppress your natural human conscience, your innate revulsion at killing, and replace it with unquestioning obedience. You were learning that violence was not a last resort. Violence was a tool of governance. Violence was righteous. Violence was your duty. The psychological impact on the perpetrators was as significant as the impact on the victims. The Crypteia was not simply a security operation. It was an initiation rite, a form of psychological conditioning designed to transform young men into instruments of state violence. By participating in murder, even authorized murder, even murder of enslaved people deemed subhuman by society, these young men were being fundamentally transformed. They were being shaped into people capable of absolutely anything, if the state demanded it. They were being robbed of their humanity and replaced with a military machine. For a modern person transported into this system, the reality would be absolutely nightmarish. If you were a Spartan male selected for the Crypteia, You would be asked to commit acts that your entire moral framework would recoil from. You would be forced to stab human beings who had done nothing to you personally, who posed no direct threat to you simply because the state had declared them killable. The psychological trauma of this would be profound and lasting. Many of the young men who participated in the cryptia likely experienced what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though the Spartans had no language for this. They simply expected you to absorb it, to accept it as the cost of being Spartan, and if you were a helot, you would be living in a state of constant, all-consuming fear. Every shadow could be an assassin. Every sound in the night could be your death approaching. You would lie awake listening, your nerves frayed, your body tense. Sleep would become nearly impossible. The constant stress would wear on your body and mind, and there would be no escape, no hope, no possibility of change. This was the reality for thousands of people in Sparta. Institutional violence and flogging. Beyond the cryptia, violence was woven into the everyday fabric of Spartan society. Flogging was not a punishment for serious infractions. It was a regular, ritualized practice, as much a part of daily life as eating or breathing. The most famous example was the cheese-stealing ritual that occurred at the festival dedicated to the goddess Orthia. Young Spartan boys would attempt to steal cheeses from a temple altar while guards armed with whips tried to stop them. But here is the crucial detail that reveals the true purpose of this ritual. The goal was not primarily to steal the cheese successfully. The goal was to endure the flogging. The boys who were caught were whipped publicly, and they were expected to show no sign of pain. They were expected to smile, to laugh, to demonstrate through their stoicism that they were above such petty concerns as physical suffering. This was psychological conditioning of the highest order. Pain was being reframed as an opportunity to demonstrate virtue. Suffering was being transformed into a test of character. The boys who could be whipped without crying out, without flinching, without showing any sign of distress, were the ones who gained status and honor. The ones who could not, who cried out, who begged for mercy, who showed their pain, were shamed and ostracized. The ritual floggings sometimes resulted in death. Boys died being whipped to death while their peers watched. The deaths were not always prevented or mourned. In some cases, it was considered an acceptable cost of the hardening process. Plutarch records instances where young Spartan boys literally died on the whipping ground, and the society simply absorbed this and moved on. The next generation of boys were subjected to the same ritual, knowing that death was a possible outcome. Over time, your skin would be marked with scars. Your pain receptors would become so sensitized through constant stimulation that your nervous system would become dysregulated. You would have difficulty modulating pain. Your capacity for empathy might be damaged. You would learn to view suffering not as something to be avoided, but as something to be sought out and embraced as a test of worthiness. If you were male and Spartan, you would spend your entire life being struck by authority figures. The older boys would strike you. The adult instructors would strike you. If you violated some rule or protocol, the magistrates would order you stripped and flogged. If you distinguished yourself, you might still be whipped as a test. Violence was not something that happened to you occasionally. It was your constant reality. For a modern person, the psychological damage of this would be severe and lasting. Your nervous system would be in a constant state of hyperarousal, always braced for the next blow. Your sense of bodily autonomy would be shattered. Your capacity to trust would be compromised. You would develop anxiety and possibly depression. You would be at constant risk of psychological breakdown. The erasure of culture and intellectual life. But there is another dimension to Spartan cruelty that is often overlooked in discussions of their military prowess. The Spartans did not merely create a harsh physical environment. They created a cultural wasteland, a society deliberately stripped of the things that make life meaningful and worth living. You might be surprised to learn that in the 7th and 6th centuries before the Common Era, Sparta was actually a cultural center. The city produced more poets than perhaps any other Greek city-state. The innovative lyric poet Alcman pioneered a form of poetry that diverged from the epic celebration of war and focused instead on desire, emotion, and the beauties of nature. Spartans were patrons of music and dance. Foreign poets traveled to Sparta to perform because they knew they would receive a warm reception. The Spartans possessed an artistic heritage that was vibrant and sophisticated, but this culture was systematically destroyed. The lawgiver Lycurgus, whether he was a historical figure or a later idealization remains debated, allegedly implemented a comprehensive program of cultural suppression. He banned professions deemed unnecessary, teachers of rhetoric, jewelers, artisans, sculptors, anyone whose labor did not directly contribute to military might. He banned precious metals such as gold and silver. He refused to allow the use of coins, replacing them with iron money that was intentionally made so heavy and unwieldy that it could not easily be carried, effectively preventing trade and commerce with other cities. By doing this, the Spartans severed themselves from the broader cultural world of ancient Greece. You could not travel freely to Athens to study philosophy. You could not import wines and goods that represented cultural exchange. You could not engage in the intellectual discourse that characterized other Greek city-states. You were cut off, isolated, alone with your suffering and your military training. The Spartans took this isolation even further. They banned foreign travel for citizens. You could not simply leave Sparta to see the wider world. You could not study under philosophers in Athens. You could not experience the cultural achievements of other societies. Your entire universe was compressed into the military state. You existed in a kind of cultural prison, surrounded by the same people, performing the same rituals, learning the same propaganda, year after year, decade after decade. And they went to extraordinary lengths to suppress even the artistic heritage that was part of their own past. They banned helots from performing the poetry of Alcman and Terpander, their own greatest poets, forcing enslaved people instead to sing only low and baseless songs, simple martial hymns designed to serve military purposes. Even their connection to their own greatest cultural achievements was severed and forbidden. Within this cultural wasteland, the opportunities for intellectual growth were virtually non-existent. The Spartan education system, the agoge, focused exclusively on physical training and military indoctrination. There was almost no instruction in literature, philosophy, science, mathematics, or the arts. Unlike Athenian boys who learned rhetoric and logic to prepare them for citizenship and democratic participation, Spartan boys learned only to obey, to fight, and to kill. Their minds were not developed. They were not cultivated. They were not educated in any meaningful sense. They were simply trained the way you might train an animal to perform specific tasks. The contrast with Athens was stark. and devastating. In Athens, boys learned to think critically, to question authority, to engage in philosophical debate. They learned poetry and music not merely as tools of propaganda, but as expressions of human creativity and emotion. They learned to value wisdom and beauty and truth. Their education prepared them for citizenship in a democratic state where they would participate in governance and contribute to culture. In Sparta, you learned only obedience. You learned that questioning was dangerous. You learned that creativity was weakness. You learned that beauty was a distraction from duty. You learned that the only worthy thought was the thought that served the military. Your mind, like your body, was systematically broken and reshaped according to state purposes. Imagine being a Spartan young man with perhaps a spark of curiosity, a desire to understand the world beyond the narrow confines of military training. You would have nowhere to go with that curiosity. There were no schools teaching philosophy. There were no libraries. There were no public forums for intellectual debate. There were no mentors who could guide you in learning about mathematics or astronomy or medicine or history. Your curiosity would be seen as dangerous, as a sign of disloyalty, as a potential precursor to rebellion. You would learn to suppress it, to bury it, to pretend it did not exist. The Spartans understood that an educated populace is a dangerous populace. An educated person asks questions. An educated person compares their society to others. An educated person recognizes injustice and has the intellectual tools to imagine alternatives. An educated person might rebel. So the Spartans ensured that their population remained deliberately ignorant, deliberately deprived of the intellectual tools necessary to think critically or imagine a different way of life. This cultural and intellectual deprivation had profound psychological consequences. Humans are meaning-making creatures. We need beauty. We need art. We need intellectual stimulation. We need to be able to develop our talents and pursue our interests. When these needs are systematically denied, when your entire existence is reduced to physical training and obedience, your psychological health deteriorates. The constant restriction of thought creates a kind of psychological claustrophobia. Your mind, like your body, feels trapped. You have no outlet for creativity. You have no way to express your individual personality. You have no access to the broader world of human knowledge and achievement. You are confined to a narrow space, and that confinement becomes psychologically damaging. For a modern person transported to Sparta, the intellectual deprivation alone would be agonizing. You would find yourself in a society where the concerns that occupy modern educated people, philosophy, science, literature, art, history, are not merely absent, but actively suppressed. You could not read books because there were no books worth reading. You could not have intellectual conversations because such conversations were discouraged. You could not pursue any interest that did not directly serve military purposes. Your mind would atrophy. Your psychological health would deteriorate. The surveillance state and absolute control, every moment of your life in Sparta, would be observed. There was no privacy. There was no refuge. There were no spaces where you could be yourself, where you could let your guard down, where you could experience autonomy or individuality. As a child, you lived in military barracks with dozens of other boys. There were no individual sleeping quarters. You slept on a thin mat on the floor, shoulder to shoulder with your age mates. There were communal latrines with no stalls, no privacy screens. When you needed to urinate or defecate, you did so in full view of everyone around you. Your most intimate bodily functions became public events. The older boys had authority over the younger boys and could discipline them at will. They could demand that younger boys sing songs or perform tasks. They could strike them for infractions, real or imagined. There was no appeal, no recourse. The hierarchy was absolute. And all of this occurred under the watchful eye of the adult male overseers, who were constantly evaluating the behavior of every child, noting deficiencies and deviations, ensuring that the system of control was functioning properly. As an adult, conditions did not improve. You were still expected to eat in communal mess halls rather than with your family. You still lived partially in the barracks or in other communal living situations. You were still subject to observation and evaluation. Your relationships, your activities, your thoughts and opinions were still subject to scrutiny and criticism. The Spartans believed that through constant surveillance, they could control not just behavior, but thought itself. They could prevent dissent before it emerged. They could identify potential sources of resistance and eliminate them. They could maintain absolute social conformity through the simple expedient of never allowing anyone to have the opportunity to think independently for very long. This level of surveillance has profound psychological impacts. When you are constantly observed, you internalize the observer. You begin to police your own thoughts and behaviors. You become your own jailer. The state does not need to constantly physically restrain you because you have been psychologically conditioned to restrain yourself. You do not think of forbidden thoughts because you have learned that thinking itself is dangerous. You do not desire forbidden things because you have learned that desire itself is a form of rebellion. The Spartans achieved what modern totalitarian regimes have also sought. They created a society where external control mechanisms became internalized and self-perpetuating. By eliminating privacy, by eliminating the possibility of individual thought, by making observation and reporting a part of the social fabric, they created a society that policed itself. Each person became a potential informant against every other person. Trust was destroyed. Relationships were compromised. The social fabric was poisoned. For a modern person accustomed to privacy, to personal space, to the ability to have a private mental life, this would be absolutely unbearable. You would experience it as a form of psychological torture. Your sense of self would begin to disintegrate. You would lose the ability to distinguish between your authentic thoughts and feelings and the thoughts and feelings you were supposed to have. You would become increasingly paranoid and anxious. You would be unable to relax or rest. The constant surveillance would wear on you like acid, slowly dissolving your psychological coherence peaks. The burden of warfare and the phalanx. Now we must understand what all this training and brutalization was ultimately designed to create. Warriors for the phalanx formation, one of the most devastating military tactics ancient warfare had ever known. The phalanx was a military formation consisting of closely packed soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder in deep rows. Each hoplite, a fully armed Greek infantryman, carried a round shield called a hoplon, which gave the formation its name. They were armed with long spears, typically between 7 and 9 meters in length, and wore bronze armor over their bodies. The formation worked through absolute discipline and coordination. Each soldier relied entirely on the soldiers beside him and behind him. You could not break formation. You could not run. You could not hesitate. When the command came, the entire formation moved as one. The spears of the front rows extended outward, creating a wall of points that made it virtually impossible for an enemy to approach without being impaled. Behind the front ranks, additional soldiers were packed tightly, ready to step forward to replace anyone who fell. This was the primary military tactic used by the Spartans, and it is where all the brutalization, the starvation, the endless drilling, the systematic psychological destruction led. The Spartan phalanx became legendary across the ancient world. When it was intact and well-trained, it was nearly unstoppable. The Spartans did not fear tactics or innovation. In fact, they largely rejected the idea that hoplite warfare could be improved through tactical innovation. What they believed in was overwhelming discipline, perfect coordination, and the unwillingness of their soldiers to break formation or retreat under any circumstances. This unwillingness to retreat came from years of conditioning. You had been taught since childhood that retreat was the ultimate shame. You had been taught that death was preferable to fleeing. You had been conditioned to suppress your natural survival instinct and replace it with absolute obedience to the formation. Your own life did not matter. Only the success of the phalanx mattered. When two phalanxes clashed, the result was often a pushing match called the othismos. The soldiers in the front ranks would attempt to drive forward with their shields while maintaining their formation. The soldiers behind would push against their comrades' backs, adding weight and force. The formation that maintained its cohesion the longest, the one that did not break, would eventually push through the enemy formation, and then came the slaughter. Once the formation broke, the soldiers became vulnerable, and the killing could be swift and complete. But for you, as a soldier in the phalanx, the experience of battle would be absolutely horrifying. You could not see much of the field. You could only see the soldiers immediately beside you and in front of you. You would feel the crush of bodies behind you, pushing you forward. The sounds would be deafening, the screaming of the wounded, the calls of officers trying to maintain order, the sickening sound of spears piercing flesh and bone. Your spear would penetrate bodies. You would feel the resistance of muscle and organs. You would smell blood and bowel and the reek of human terror. Men would fall beside you, screaming. You could not stop to help them. You could not even process their death fully because you had to maintain formation, had to keep pushing, had to stay alive long enough for your formation to win. If you broke formation, if you showed fear, if you attempted to retreat, there were officers behind you watching, ready to strike you down where you stood for cowardice. Your own side might kill you for breaking ranks. You were trapped between the enemy in front and the enforced discipline behind. You had no choice but to continue forward, continue fighting, continue killing, until either the enemy broke or you fell. For a modern person, the psychological trauma of experiencing this would be profound. Humans are not naturally suited to this kind of mechanized, organized violence. We have empathy. We have a natural revulsion at killing. The close personal nature of phalanx warfare, feeling the body of your enemy on your spear, watching him die, then moving forward to stab another man, would likely cause immediate psychological breakdown. Post-traumatic stress disorder would be virtually universal among survivors. But the Spartans did not allow for such breakdowns. The conditioning was meant to override these natural human reactions. You were taught that your reactions did not matter. Your feelings did not matter. Only obedience mattered. Only the success of the formation mattered. And you were taught this so thoroughly, so systematically, that by the time you arrived on a battlefield, much of your humanity had already been destroyed. Women's impossible position. Spartan women, paradoxically, are often portrayed in popular culture as unusually free and empowered. They were educated. They participated in athletic activities. They had property rights. Compared to women in other Greek city-states, Spartan women did have remarkable freedoms. But this freedom was not liberation. It was conscription of a different kind. Spartan girls received formal education in athletics, music, and dance, skills that were considered important for producing strong children. They learned to wrestle and to run, often exercising naked or nearly naked while men watched and evaluated their bodies. The purpose was not to create female warriors or to celebrate female strength as an end in itself. The purpose was to create bodies capable of bearing strong sons who would become soldiers. Women's property rights and economic independence were not gifts of enlightened male rulers. They were necessary byproducts of a system where the men spent most of their time in military camps, away from their homes and families. Because men were absent, women had to manage estates and property. Because men were unavailable for many of the activities required to maintain society, women had to step into those roles. Women's freedoms were granted not out of any principle of equality, but out of practical necessity. The ultimate purpose of a Spartan woman's life was to produce sons for the state. This was not merely encouraged, it was your entire reason for existing. Your education, your physical training, your status in society, all of it was designed to make you a more efficient producer of future warriors. And childbirth in Sparta was extraordinarily dangerous. In the ancient world generally, childbirth was a leading cause of death among women. Maternal mortality rates were staggering. In some estimates, 1 in 4 or even 1 in 3 pregnancies resulted in maternal death or serious complication. But in Sparta, where women were younger when they bore their first children, where they were less likely to be properly nourished, where medical knowledge was limited and often counterproductive, the dangers were even greater. The only Spartan women who received burial monuments were those who died in childbirth. This was presented as an honor. Women who died in childbirth were equated with soldiers who died in battle. Both had given their lives for the state. Both were heroes. But this framing cannot hide the underlying horror. Spartan women were essentially encouraged to accept the possibility of death as the price of fulfilling their societal role. Imagine being a young woman in Sparta. You are perhaps 15 or 16 years old. You have been educated, trained in athletics, and now you are expected to marry a man significantly older than you, perhaps in his late 20s or early 30s. He has been spending most of his life in military camps. He may have had limited contact with women. The marriage is not a romantic partnership, but a state-sanctioned arrangement designed to produce offspring. You are expected to become pregnant quickly. When you are pregnant, your body becomes a battleground of discomfort, pain, and fear. Pregnancy and childbirth in the ancient world were processes that could kill you. Infection was common. Internal bleeding during childbirth could be fatal. Complications like preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, and placental abnormalities could occur without warning and without any medical ability to intervene effectively. A torn uterus during childbirth could result in death from internal bleeding within hours. An infection after delivery could lead to sepsis and death within days. If you survived childbirth, you would likely become pregnant again within a year or two. And again, and again. A Spartan woman of reproductive age was expected to bear multiple children, perhaps many of them. Each pregnancy was another roll of the dice, Another chance that this time the complications would be too severe, that this time your body would fail. Your life would be a succession of pregnancies, births, and the constant fear of death. If your child was born with any kind of deformity or disability, if they failed the examination by the Gerousia, the Council of Elders, they would be taken from you and exposed on Mount Taygetus. They would be left in the cold to die. This was not framed as a tragic necessity. It was presented as a rational decision, a kind of ancient eugenics program designed to keep the Spartan bloodline pure and strong. But as the mother, your role was simply to accept this. Your feelings about it were irrelevant. Your child belonged to the state, and the state had decided your child was not worthy of life. And when your son turned 7, he would be taken from you. The child you had risked your life to bear, whom you had nursed and cared for and loved, would be handed over to the state. You would not raise him. You would not watch him grow. You would barely see him until he was a grown man, and by then he would be a stranger, shaped entirely by the military system, emotionally disconnected from family bonds. The boy you loved would essentially be dead, replaced by a warrior. For a modern woman transported to Sparta, the experience would be a nightmare of enforced pregnancy, constant danger, limited agency, and the knowledge that your body was not your own, and that your children could be taken from you at any moment. The psychological trauma would be severe and lasting. Disease, parasites, and sanitation horrors. We have discussed the intentional cruelties of Spartan society, the deliberate starvation, the organized violence, the psychological manipulation, and the systematic erasure of culture and intellect. But there is also an entire other category of suffering inflicted not through deliberate policy, but through the living conditions that Spartans accepted as normal: disease, parasites, and the horrors of sanitation. Sparta was located in the Laconian Valley, a region with a Mediterranean climate. Summers were hot and dry, reaching temperatures around 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Winters were cooler, with temperatures dropping to around 50 degrees Fahrenheit and significant rainfall. This combination of climate factors created an environment that was conducive to disease. The wet winters meant damp living conditions. The hot summers meant rapid spoilage of food. The average Spartan lived in crowded conditions. Soldiers lived in barracks with dozens or even hundreds of other men. Even civilians lived in relatively close quarters. With such density of population, disease spread rapidly. The sanitation infrastructure was minimal. Toilets were communal and primitive. Waste management was crude at best. There were no sewage systems designed to remove waste efficiently and safely. Human excrement accumulated in and around the city, fouling water sources and creating breeding grounds for disease-carrying insects. In such conditions, intestinal parasites thrived. Roundworms, whipworms, hookworms. These were nearly universal afflictions. Children who studied Spartan skeletal remains found evidence that intestinal parasites were endemic in the population. These parasites caused chronic intestinal distress, malabsorption of nutrients, and general physical malaise. If you were living on a calorie-restricted diet to begin with, losing significant nutrition to parasitic infection meant that your already inadequate diet became even less adequate. You would be in a constant state of mild to moderate gastrointestinal distress. Beyond intestinal parasites, bacterial infections were common. Dysentery, severe bloody diarrhea caused by bacterial infection, would periodically sweep through populations. Water supplies were easily contaminated. Food could quickly spoil or become infected. Without any understanding of germ theory or the importance of hand washing, the Spartans lived in a constant low-level state of gastrointestinal crisis. Periodic outbreaks of dysentery would kill dozens or even hundreds of people. Respiratory infections would spread through the barracks and communal living spaces. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and other respiratory illnesses would afflict people, particularly during the winter months. Without antibiotics, without proper medical care, respiratory infections could be fatal. A simple cold could turn into pneumonia and kill you within weeks. A cough that lasted through the winter could develop into tuberculosis, a chronic disease that would slowly destroy your lungs over months or years. Skin infections were also common, particularly in a population that was constantly exercising, constantly sweating, constantly getting cut and bruised. Staph infections, fungal infections, parasitic skin infections. These would establish themselves on your skin and be difficult to eliminate in conditions of poor hygiene. A small cut could become infected and, without modern antibiotics, could lead to blood poisoning and death. Even if none of these infections killed you immediately, the cumulative effect was a population that was chronically ill. People were dealing with constant low-level fevers, constant gastrointestinal distress, constant skin irritation, chronic respiratory symptoms. Your body was never entirely well. You were never free from illness. You were just living day after day with whatever infections or parasites you were currently hosting. The combination of chronic infection, malnutrition, physical exhaustion, and psychological stress would wear you down relentlessly. And the Spartans had no effective medical knowledge. They had no antibiotics. They had no ability to perform surgery safely. They had folk remedies, many of which were ineffective and some of which were harmful. Doctors would apply poultices of herbs or perform bloodletting, believing that removing blood would restore balance to the body. In reality, bloodletting just weakened people further. If you developed a serious infection, your options were essentially to hope that your immune system could fight it off or to die. For a modern person transported to Sparta, the disease environment would be absolutely devastating. Your immune system, adapted to a world of modern sanitation and medicine, would be exposed to pathogenic challenges it had not encountered in centuries. You would become ill repeatedly. The diseases would compound. A respiratory infection could lead to pneumonia, which could be complicated by intestinal parasites that prevented your body from absorbing the nutrients needed to fight infection. A small cut could become infected with MRSA or other antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Without modern medicine, you would likely not survive very long. Religious obligation and ritual terror. The Spartans were profoundly religious. Religion was not something practiced on weekends or in specific spaces designated for worship. Religion permeated every aspect of life. And like so many other aspects of Spartan society, religion was weaponized, transformed into a tool of control and an instrument of psychological manipulation. The Spartans worshipped Apollo, and their most important religious festival was the Hyacinthia, an annual celebration dedicated to Apollo and to the youth Hyacinth. But unlike religious festivals in other Greek cities, which were occasions for celebration and joy, the Hyacinthia was a carefully orchestrated ritual designed to reinforce hierarchy, to test endurance, and to bind society through shared experience of controlled emotion. The festival lasted 3 days. The first day was devoted to mourning and ritual grief. The eating of bread and cakes was forbidden. The wearing of wreaths was forbidden. Joyful songs were forbidden. Instead, there were offerings placed at the tomb of the deceased Hyacinth, and the day was spent in ritualized sorrow. There were funeral meals and a full day of ritual grief. Everyone was required to participate, to show appropriate sorrow, to demonstrate their commitment to the state's approved emotional responses. The second day shifted to a more joyful tone, celebrating the rebirth of Hyacinth as a divine being. There were athletic competitions, horse races, and other events. But these were not casual recreational activities. They were competitive events designed to identify the strongest and fastest among the population, designed to reinforce the hierarchy, designed to celebrate physical prowess. The third day featured choral performances and the sharing of poems. 3 separate choruses, youths, men in their prime, and elders, gathered and sang traditional songs that honored Apollo and emphasized each group's strength and fitness. Each group sang lines that reinforced their position in the hierarchy. The youths sang of their potential future strength, the men in their prime sang of their current strength, and the elders sang of their past strength. The entire event was choreographed to reinforce social order. The entire festival mimicked life in a military camp, complete with the sharing of food in separate tents representing different tribal groups and with commands issued by heralds. Even the religious festival was an occasion for practicing military organization and hierarchy. There was no break from the system. Even when you were supposed to be engaged in spiritual activities, you were still being trained, still being conditioned, still being controlled. The point of all this was not spiritual enrichment in the way that modern people might understand it. The point was social control. The point was to reinforce unity and hierarchy. The point was to ensure that even spiritual experiences were instrumentalized in service to the military political system. You could not have a private spiritual experience. All spiritual experience was managed and controlled by the state. And there were other religious observances that were even more sinister. The Spartans believed that they needed to consult the gods through oracles before making major decisions. But the oracles were often consulted not to gain divine wisdom, but to manufacture divine sanction for decisions that had already been made. If the Spartan authorities wanted to declare war, they would consult the oracle, and the oracle would confirm that the gods approved. If they wanted to persecute the helots, they would consult the oracle, and the oracle would sanction it. The gods always seemed to approve of whatever the Spartan authorities wanted to do. For a modern person transported to Sparta, the religious environment would be oppressive and alienating. You would be expected to participate in rituals that felt alien and meaningless. You would be expected to suppress your own spiritual impulses and accept the state-mandated version of religion. You would begin to distrust your own internal experiences and perceptions, accepting instead the official interpretation of spiritual reality provided by the authorities. Your soul would be colonized by the state, just as your body had been colonized. Social hierarchy and constant humiliation. Spartan society was not egalitarian, despite what some ancient sources suggest. It was rigidly hierarchical, and your position in that hierarchy determined every aspect of your experience. There were the Spartiates, free-born Spartan citizens who were fully part of the military system. There were the Perioeci, skilled craftsmen and traders who were technically free but subordinate to the Spartiates. And there were the helots, enslaved agricultural workers who formed the base of the entire system and likely constituted the vast majority of the population, perhaps outnumbering free Spartans by 10 to 1. If you were a Spartiate, you benefited from the system in certain ways. You had access to communal dining, which meant you had your ration of food. You participated in military training, and thus had a role in society. You might eventually achieve full citizenship with all its accompanying privileges, but your freedom was illusory. You were as much a prisoner of the system as the helots were, though the nature of your imprisonment was different. You were imprisoned by duty, by obligation, by the internalized values that made you willing to sacrifice everything for the state. You owned land worked by helots, which meant you had economic security, but you could never leave. You could never develop other interests. You could never imagine a different way of life. If you were a perioesi, you occupied a strange middle position. You were not enslaved, but you were not fully part of the Spartan military system either. You were allowed to practice trades and crafts, which the Spartiates were forbidden from doing. You could be artisans, merchants, skilled workers. In some cases, you might accumulate considerable wealth. But you were constantly reminded of your subordinate status. You had to defer to Spartiates. You could not fully participate in Spartan political and military life. You had no voice in government. You were wealthy in some cases, but wealth brought you no real power. And if you were a helot, your life was unending misery and terror. You were enslaved. You had no legal rights. You could be killed without consequence. Your family bonds were recognized in some limited ways. You could live with your family unit, but they could be broken at any time, at the whim of your masters. The Spartan state could sell you, could move you, could separate you from your spouse or children. Every single day of your existence was characterized by oppression and fear. The Spartans went out of their way to humiliate the helots. Helots were forced to wear dogskin caps and leather garments to mark their slave status. They were ritually humiliated in public settings. Plutarch records that Spartan citizens would force helots to become severely drunk and then parade them in front of young Spartan boys as an object lesson. This is what drunkenness looks like. This is what degradation looks like. This is what you should fear becoming. The helots would be forced to sing degrading songs and perform demeaning dances. Even among the Spartiates, there was constant testing and evaluation. You were constantly being compared to your peers. Your physical prowess was constantly being assessed. Your obedience was constantly being monitored. There was no resting, no moment where you could feel secure in your status. There was always the possibility of failure, of being marked as unworthy, of being excluded from the military elite. And if you fell out of favor, if you were seen as unreliable, if you questioned the system or showed insufficient dedication, you could find yourself demoted, losing access to communal dining, and thus your economic security. For a modern person, this social structure would be psychologically devastating. If you were a Spartiate, you would be trapped in a system that demanded constant sacrifice and offered nothing but the opportunity to sacrifice more. You would be a prisoner disguised as a citizen. If you were a perioesi, you would be constantly reminded of your subordinate status and excluded from full participation in society. You would live your entire life knowing that no matter what you achieved, you would always be less than, always inferior. If you were a helot, you would be living in a nightmare of oppression and terror, knowing that your masters had the power of life and death over you, and that they would exercise that power at any moment, for any reason or no reason at all. The economic and political system, a machine of control. The Spartan system was not just brutal. It was carefully engineered to prevent any possibility of change or reform. The political system maintained this through an elaborate system of checks and balances that prevented any single leader from accumulating too much power but that also prevented any democratic participation or individual agency. Sparta had two kings, not one. This dual monarchy meant that neither king could act unilaterally. Any major decision required both kings to agree, or at least not to actively oppose it. If the two kings disagreed, the matter would go to the Gerousia, the council of 28 elders, who would deliberate and make a decision. Above even the Gerousia were the ephors, 5 annually elected magistrates with extraordinary power. The ephors could impeach kings, could declare war, could impose punishments. The system was designed so that power was distributed and no single person could become too powerful. But here is the critical point. None of this democratic-sounding machinery actually created freedom or justice. In fact, it created a system where the entire apparatus was designed to prevent any change to the fundamental structure of society. The system perpetuated itself through institutional design. The Gerousia was composed of men over 60 years old, all from aristocratic families, all with a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. The ephors were elected from the same elite. The ordinary citizens had no real voice. The Apella, the assembly of all adult male Spartiates, could vote on measures proposed by the Gerousia, but they could not propose their own measures. They could only approve or reject what was presented to them. And crucially, the economy was structured to prevent wealth accumulation and independent economic power. Spartiates were forbidden from engaging in trade or commerce. They could not be merchants or artisans. They could only be warriors. Their land was farmed by helots, and they received a regular allotment of food from the communal mess. This ensured that no Spartiate could become wealthy enough to challenge the system. Everyone was dependent on the state for their basic subsistence. The economic system that supported all of this was entirely predicated on helot slavery. The helots produced all the food, all the goods, all the wealth that allowed the Spartiates to spend their entire lives training for war. Without helots, the system would collapse. And because the Spartiates were so dependent on helot labor, they lived in constant fear of helot rebellion. This is why the Cryptia existed. This is why the Spartans declared war on the helots every year. This is why helots lived in constant terror. The entire system required their complete subjugation. For a modern person, understanding this system would be both illuminating and deeply depressing. You would recognize that Sparta was not a society designed to be just or to maximize human flourishing. It was a society designed to maintain power in the hands of a military elite while minimizing the possibility of challenge or change. Every institution, every policy, every practice was designed to this end. There was literally no mechanism in the system for reform, no way for injustice to be corrected, no hope that things could get better. The system was locked into place, and everyone within it was trapped. Psychological breakdown, the cumulative effect. We have examined each component of Spartan cruelty in isolation: the physical ordeal of the agoge, the deliberate starvation, the cryptia, the institutionalized violence, the systematic erasure of culture and intellect, the surveillance, the religious control, the disease, the social hierarchy, and the political economic system that locked it all in place. But the true horror of ancient Sparta lies not in any individual system, but in the cumulative, synergistic effect of all these systems working together in a single unified program of human destruction. Imagine the experience in its totality. You are 7 years old when you are torn from your mother's arms and placed into a military barracks. You will never live with your family again. You will never have privacy. You will never have autonomy over your own body. You will spend the next 23 years being trained, tested, and broken down physically and psychologically. Your body will be constantly pushed to its limits and beyond. You will be hungry virtually all the time. Your hunger will be intentional, part of a system designed to keep you weak and controllable. You will be flogged regularly, sometimes in public rituals, sometimes for infractions, real or imagined. You will learn to dissociate from pain, to view your body as something that happens to you rather than something that belongs to you. Every moment of your life will be observed. There will be no privacy. There will be no refuge. There will be no place where you can be yourself, where you can think your own thoughts, where you can have feelings that are not monitored and evaluated by others. You will internalize the surveillance. You will police your own thoughts. You will become your own jailer. You will be fed propaganda constantly. You will be taught that your society is virtuous and noble. You will be taught that sacrifice is virtue. You will be taught that suffering is evidence of fitness and worth. You will be taught that individuality is weakness and that obedience is the highest good. You will be taught that the helots are subhuman and that their deaths are righteous. You will be taught that the system cannot be changed, that any attempt to change it is futile and foolish. You will participate in rituals designed to further embed these messages into your consciousness. But you will also be intellectually starved. You will have no access to the world of ideas. You will not be able to read great works of literature. You will not be able to study philosophy or science. You will not be able to discuss ideas with teachers or mentors. You will not be able to engage in the kinds of conversations that make life intellectually meaningful. Your mind will be narrowed, constrained, reduced to a single purpose: obedience. You will become intellectually incurious, intellectually impoverished, incapable of independent thought. You will live with constant uncertainty and fear. You will never feel truly safe. You will never know if you will be selected for the crypteia, if you will be sent out to hunt human beings in the night. You will never know if you will be marked as unworthy, if you will be excluded from the military elite. You will never know if a minor deviation from expected behavior will result in public flogging or worse. You will live with the knowledge that the political system that governs you is immutable, that reform is impossible, that you are trapped. You will eventually march into battle with your military unit and experience the horror and chaos and violence of ancient warfare. You will kill people. You will see your companions killed. You will be traumatized by these experiences, but you will not be allowed to process the trauma. You will simply be expected to return to training and do it all again. If you are male, you will eventually marry, probably to a girl essentially selected for you by the state. But you will continue to live partially in the barracks, continuing to participate in communal meals rather than eating with your wife and family. Your wife and children will be secondary to your duties to the state. You will spend more time with your military unit than with your family. You will likely die in battle before your youngest child is old enough to remember you. If you are female, your life will be devoted to producing sons for the state. You will be educated specifically to bear strong children. You will endure the dangers of pregnancy and childbirth multiple times. You will be constantly aware of the dangers, the fact that each pregnancy could kill you. You will know that if you die in childbirth, your gravestone will honor you for this sacrifice. You will know that if your child is born with any flaw, they will be taken from you and left to die. You will know that when your son turns 7, he will be taken from you. The child you risked your life to bear will be given to the state and shaped into something alien to you. You will live on the edge of starvation. Your body will be host to parasites. You will suffer from chronic infections. You will never be fully healthy. You will always be in low-level pain and discomfort. The food you eat will be barely edible. You will be constantly hungry. This will be your normal. You will be constantly aware that you are living in a surveillance state, that you are being observed, that any transgression could result in severe punishment. You will be constantly aware of the arbitrary nature of power, of the fact that at any moment, for any reason or no reason, you could be marked as unworthy or dangerous. And you will be told that this is good. You will be told that this is virtuous. You will be told that this is the price of being part of something greater than yourself. You will be told that if you suffer, it means you are strong. You will be told that if you are in pain, it means you are disciplined. You will be told that if you have no freedom, it means you are free, free from the weakness of individual desire, free from the burden of choice, free to serve the state with complete devotion. But underneath all of this propaganda, if you retained any capacity for authentic thought and feeling, if some part of your mind resisted the conditioning, you would be aware of a terrible truth. Your entire life is a lie. The suffering you have been told is virtue is simply suffering. The freedom you have been told you possess is absence of freedom. The strength you have been told you have developed is the strength of a broken thing that has learned not to resist its own destruction. The society you have been told is noble and virtuous is actually a horror, a machine designed to grind human beings into instruments of war. After decades of this, if you survived to old age, you would be a profoundly damaged human being. Your capacity for intimacy would be damaged. Your capacity for authentic connection to other human beings would be compromised. Your relationship to your own body would be distorted. Your relationship to your own emotions would be damaged. Your capacity for independent thought would be nearly destroyed. You would have been so thoroughly shaped by the system that it would be nearly impossible to imagine an alternative way of being. And if you were a modern person transported into this system, you would not have decades to adapt. You would break much faster. The psychological toll would be rapid and severe. Within weeks, you would be showing signs of severe psychological distress, anxiety, depression, dissociation, possibly even psychotic symptoms as your mind struggled to cope with the degree of violation and control you were experiencing. Within months, you would likely be dead or insane. Why you wouldn't survive? So let us return to the central question. Why wouldn't you survive a single day in ancient Sparta? The answer is complex. You might not survive because the physical demands alone would be too much for a body unaccustomed to such treatment. You might not survive because the starvation would slowly kill you, grinding you down through malnutrition over weeks or months. You might not survive because one of the endemic diseases would catch you and your immune system, without support from modern medicine, would be unable to fight it off. You might not survive because the psychological torture would drive you mad, and in your madness, you would either kill yourself or do something that would result in your execution. But more fundamentally, you wouldn't survive, because Sparta was not designed to allow survival in any meaningful sense. It was designed to obliterate the self, to destroy autonomy, to transform human beings into instruments of the state. You might keep your body alive for a time, but your soul, yourself, your capacity to think and feel and desire autonomously, these would be destroyed. The Spartans understood something that many people still do not want to acknowledge: that there are systems, social structures, and ways of organizing society that are fundamentally hostile to human flourishing. Sparta was one such system. It did not merely constrain freedom. It did not merely impose hardship. It was engineered to damage the human psyche, to create psychological damage as a deliberate policy. If you were transported to ancient Sparta, you would quickly find yourself in a situation from which there was no escape. There would be no opportunity to leave. There would be no outside support. There would be no one to help you. You would be completely dependent on a system that viewed you as nothing more than a tool to be used and discarded. The horror is not a single dramatic moment of violence or suffering. The horror is the realization that every day would be like this, that every day would bring new degradation and new suffering, and that this would continue until you died. And perhaps the most terrifying aspect of all is the recognition that Sparta actually existed. These were not fantasies or exaggerations. These were real societies with real people living under these real conditions. The Spartans were not mythological creatures or fictional characters. They were human beings who participated in these systems, who committed these cruelties, who viewed this suffering as normal and justified. They created a society so hostile to human flourishing that even other ancient Greeks, who themselves had vastly different values and social structures than we do in the modern world, looked at Sparta with a mixture of awe and horror. The Spartans had discovered something terrible: that you could break human beings in such a way that they would accept any degradation, any suffering, any loss of autonomy, as long as you convinced them that it was in service to something greater than themselves. And so, dear listener, remember this: when you encounter modern movements or ideologies that demand total sacrifice, that eliminate privacy and freedom, that demand absolute obedience, that promise greatness through suffering, remember Sparta. Remember that such systems are not sources of strength or virtue. They are machines of destruction. They are designed to damage human beings, to transform them into something less than human, to obliterate the very things that make life worth living. A person from our modern world would not survive a single day in ancient Sparta. But more importantly, they should not want to survive in such a system. The very survival that Sparta offered was not survival worth having. It was merely the continuation of a body long after the spirit that inhabited it had been destroyed. The Spartans created what they believed would be an invincible society. And for a time, they were right. Their warriors were formidable. Their army was feared. But they achieved this not through any sustainable or admirable means. They achieved it by creating the most effective system of psychological and physical control that the ancient world had yet seen. And in the end, this system collapsed, unable to sustain itself, unable to produce new generations of warriors, ultimately defeated not just militarily, but culturally and spiritually as well. So, as you sit in the comfort of your home, warm and fed, with your privacy intact and your autonomy assured, consider yourself fortunate. Consider how fragile the freedoms you take for granted truly are. Consider how quickly such freedoms can be stripped away if people are willing to accept the seductive logic that suffering is virtue and that obedience is freedom. And consider, finally, that there are still societies in the modern world that approximate Spartan principles, that demand total sacrifice, that eliminate privacy and autonomy, that break their citizens in service to the state. The lessons of Sparta are not historical curiosities. They are warnings. They are reminders of what happens when a society decides that human flourishing is less important than military power, that freedom is less important than order, that individual well-being is less important than state strength. These lessons remain relevant today, perhaps more relevant than ever. Thank you for joining me on this descent into the darkness of ancient Sparta. Sleep well tonight, knowing that whatever struggles you face, they are far preferable to the nightmare that was daily life in this most terrible of ancient civilizations. Good night, and until next time, may you find peace in the knowledge that such horrors exist now only in history,